Hey there. Tonight we're going far back, not to palaces or marble temples, but to a time of gods, monsters, and mortals who wandered through a world shaped by fate and fire. You'll drift through the entire arc of Greek mythology, from the first breath of chaos, to the rise of Olympus, to the quiet echo of myths that still shape our world today. You'll meet heroes who bled for glory, lovers who defied the gods, and beings born from sea foam, thunder, and stubbornness. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, falling asleep to the same old stories. So, dim the lights. Let the gods whisper. Let the myths unfold. And let's begin at the very beginning, before there was anything at all. Before there were heroes, cities, or even the stars that watched silently overhead, there was only chaos. Not the noisy kind with shouting and spilled wine. No, this was capital C chaos. A vast, empty potential. No sky, no sea, no light or dark. Just the quiet before everything. And then slowly something stirred. From the void came Gaia, Earth herself, broad and eternal, steady beneath all that would one day walk upon her. Next came Tartarus, a shadowy depth beneath the world, more abyss than place. Then Eros appeared, not a fluttering cherub, but a raw force, drawing things together, setting creation into motion. From this strange, silent symphony, more emerged. Darkness, Erebus, and night, Nyx, who gave rise to day, Hemera, and ether, light. But most importantly, Gaia gave birth to Uranus, the sky, who arched above her, a canopy of stars and cold air. Together, Earth and sky would begin the first great family. And, as with many families, things started out lovely and got complicated rather quickly. Gaia and Uranus had children, 12 of them, 6 daughters and 6 sons, the Titans. Among them were Oceanus, who wrapped the world in a ring of water, and Hyperion, who carried the sun across the sky. There was Themis, who embodied divine law, and Mnemosyne, the spirit of memory. The Titans were powerful and strange, born of the earth and sky, made to shape the world. Unfortunately, Uranus found them unsettling. Perhaps they were too large, or too loud, or maybe he simply wasn't ready for fatherhood. In any case, he shoved them back inside Gaia. Yes, inside their mother. Which is never a good sign in mythology, or in obstetrics. Gaia, understandably distressed by having 12 children re-stuffed into her, began to devise a plan. She forged a great sickle from stone, and approached her buried sons in the dark. One by one, she asked for help. One by one, they remained silent, except Cronus. The youngest Titan, Cronus had a sharp mind and a patient nature, dangerous traits in combination. He took the sickle from his mother and waited, and when Uranus descended again to lie across the earth, Cronus leapt from the shadows. In one terrible stroke, he castrated his father and flung the remains into the sea. From the blood that fell to earth came strange creatures, the Erinyes, the giants, and the Meliae. From the foam of the sea, where the flesh of Uranus drifted, arose something unexpected. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, fully grown and radiant. Apparently, in Greek mythology, even acts of unspeakable violence can yield supermodels. With Uranus gone, Cronus took his place as lord of the cosmos. He freed his siblings and ruled over what would be called the Golden Age, a time when humans, newly formed, lived without sorrow, and the gods had not yet begun their meddling. But prophecy lingered. Uranus had used his last breath, or whatever equivalent sky possesses, to curse Cronus. He warned that one day Cronus too would be overthrown by his own child. Now, having personally demonstrated how this kind of thing works, Cronus decided he would avoid repeating history by doing something very traditional: eating his children. He married his sister Rhea, again, not unusual in divine circles, and every time she gave birth, he swallowed the baby whole. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, down they went, swallowed one by one, trapped inside the dark of their father's belly. Rhea was horrified, and after losing 5 children to this culinary paranoia, she came up with a plan. When her 6th child was born, she wrapped a rocking cloth and presented it to Cronus. Ever the efficient tyrant, he swallowed it without checking. The real baby, Zeus, was whisked away to the island of Crete, hidden in a cave and raised by nymphs and a divine goat named Amalthea. There, under the dripping stone ceiling of the cave, Zeus grew. He was fed, loved, and trained in secret. He listened to stories of the siblings he had never met, siblings still alive, but imprisoned within their father. And as he grew taller and stronger, so too did his resolve. One day, Zeus left the cave. He disguised himself and entered the court of Cronus as a servant. There, with the help of his grandmother Gaia, he slipped a potion into Cronus's wine, something bitter, ancient, and mildly volcanic. Cronus began to cough. Then he gagged. Then, with a noise that would echo in the halls of Olympus for generations, he vomited up 5 fully grown gods and goddesses, and also, of course, a large stone. Reunited at last, the children of Cronus stood together. They were not meek, they had not withered, they were divine and very angry. War was inevitable. The Titanomachy, the war between the old gods and the new, lasted 10 years. Cronus rallied the Titans to his side and took up residence on Mount Ophrys. Zeus and his siblings made their stronghold on Mount Olympus. Between them, the world cracked and groaned. At first, neither side could win. Titans were strong, ancient, and terrifying, but the Olympians were clever, and Zeus, ever the tactician, had an idea. He descended into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, where monsters slept and time grew heavy. There he found the Hecatonchires, massive beings with 100 arms each, and the Cyclopes, who had been imprisoned long ago by Uranus for being a little too inventive. Zeus freed them. In gratitude, the Cyclopes gave gifts: a thunderbolt for Zeus, searing and absolute, a trident for Poseidon, which could shake the seas, and for Hades, a helm of darkness, making him invisible to both god and mortal. One could argue they were the ancient world's first tech startup. Armed with these divine tools, the tide turned. Zeus hurled bolts that split mountains. Poseidon flooded battlefields. Hades walked unseen through enemy camps, sowing fear with whispers. Slowly, the Titans fell. Cronus was defeated and bound in chains of unbreakable iron. The Titans who had sided with him were cast into Tartarus, locked behind gates guarded by the 100-handed giants. Only a few escaped punishment. Themis, goddess of law, who had remained neutral, and Prometheus, who had offered quiet aid to Zeus. Atlas, the general of the Titan forces, received a special sentence. For his defiance, he was condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders, not the earth, as commonly misunderstood, but the endless heavens themselves. a job without days off or proper lumbar support. With victory secured, the gods turned to the world. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, cast lots to divide the realms. Zeus received the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. The earth, meanwhile, was left to be shared, not out of kindness, but because they couldn't decide who would clean it. And so Mount Olympus became the seat of the new gods. There they would rule. There they would fight, feast, and make poor decisions that would echo through mortal lives for centuries. The age of the Titans was over. The age of the Olympians had begun. And in the shadows of that beginning, other stories waited. Stories of men, monsters, and the strange, stubborn thing called fate. By the time the gods stood reunited, the world had already begun to hold its breath. Olympus and Othrys loomed on opposite ends of the horizon like loaded spears, and between them the air turned restless. War wasn't declared with a speech. It was simply inevitable. Cronus, unseated and humiliated, had fled to Mount Othrys, dragging with him what dignity he had left, and a number of deeply unsettled Titans. He rallied his old allies, Oceanus, Iapetus, Creus, and others, ancient beings who had once shaped the very bones of the world. These were not creatures of palace intrigue. They were elemental forces, and they were angry. Meanwhile, atop Mount Olympus, Zeus gathered his siblings. They were few in number, just 6, really, if one didn't count the stone Cronus had eaten, but they were determined. Hestia, calm and constant. Demeter, wise and watchful. Hera, proud and already sharpening her tongue for future family squabbles. Hades and Poseidon stood ready, though the former spoke little, and the latter never stopped pacing. And Zeus, the one who had freed them, stood taller than the rest. The world, unfortunately, was not yet ready for them. When the war began, it shook the roots of the earth. Lightning cracked across a sky that had no business being angry, and mountains cracked as if the bones of Gaia herself were being tested. For 10 long years, the Olympians and the Titans battled. The sound of clashing forces was said to echo across time itself, and, if you listened closely, you could hear the sigh of someone realizing this would take far longer than hoped. The Titans had strength and age, but the gods had youth and spite. And, as history has shown, spite can go a very long way. Yet despite their energy and cleverness, the Olympians were losing. The Titans held fast on Othrys, their fortresses built from stone and arrogance. Cronus was no fool. He knew war as well as prophecy. Every attempt Zeus made to break their lines was met with brutal resistance. At night, the stars seemed to flicker with fatigue. It was then that Gaia herself intervened. Though the earth had birthed both Titans and gods, she had grown weary of endless conflict. The ground was splitting, the rivers ran foul. Even mortals, those fragile little experiments, were beginning to notice that the seasons were a bit off. Gaia whispered to Zeus in his dreams. "If you want to win," she said, "you must go deeper." So Zeus did. He descended into Tartarus, a pit so deep even echoes were reluctant to visit. It was not a place of casual tourism. In its endless blackness, creatures older than fear itself were bound in silence. And there, at the bottom, he found them, the Hecatoncheires. 3 brothers, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, bound in chains that screamed when touched. Uranus had imprisoned them long ago, disturbed by their chaotic nature and the fact that shaking hands required a great deal of coordination. Alongside them were the Cyclopes, the one-eyed smiths of legend, unjustly locked away simply for being a little too handy with magma and steel. Zeus broke their bonds. The chains crumbled like wet parchment in his hands, and the freed giants rose. The very walls of Tartarus trembled as they stretched, arms unfurling, eyes blinking open for the first time in centuries. They did not speak, they simply nodded. The Cyclopes, grateful and slightly soot-stained, offered gifts. To Zeus they gave the thunderbolt not just a weapon, but a piece of the sky itself, bottled and waiting to be unleashed. To Poseidon they gave a trident that could shake the sea down to its bones. And to Hades they gave a helm of darkness, a crown of sorts, woven from shadow, that would let him move unseen even among the gods. One could say it was their way of saying thank you, though the wrapping paper left much to be desired. With these gifts, the Olympians prepared for a final assault. The battle that followed was not so much a fight as a rewriting of reality. Zeus hurled thunder that carved rivers into mountainsides. Poseidon cracked open the earth and summoned walls of water to crash against the Titan fortresses. Hades, invisible beneath his helm, slipped behind enemy lines like a whisper. No door was safe. No thought was private. Even time seemed to pause and take notes. Cronus fought fiercely, sickle in hand, teeth bared in the stormlight. He had ruled the cosmos and tasted fear. He would not go quietly. But power, once wrested from the hands of the old, rarely returns to them. And slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. Zeus struck him down. Not with a flourish, not with a speech, just one blinding strike of a sky-forged fury, and the Titan King fell. With Cronus defeated, the rest of the Titans began to break. Some tried to flee, scattering like crows before a fire. Others dropped their weapons and knelt, hoping surrender might soften the sentence. Most were cast into Tartarus, chained behind walls of black stone, watched eternally by the Hecatoncheires. The punishment was neither swift nor particularly poetic, but it was effective. A few were spared. Prometheus, who had whispered guidance to Zeus when no one else dared. Themis, who had stood aside and measured justice even as her kin roared for blood. These were allowed to walk free, if only because Zeus was pragmatic enough to keep useful minds close. Atlas, however, was singled out. For his leadership, for his refusal to bend, he was given a special punishment: to stand at the edge of the world and hold up the sky itself. Not the earth, as many mistakenly believe, the sky. An infinite ceiling with no end and no ceiling fan in sight. To this day he holds it still, with poor posture and no thanks. With the war ended, the gods stood among the wreckage. They had won, but there were decisions to make. The world could not remain unclaimed. And so the three brothers drew lots. Zeus claimed the sky, the winds, the clouds, the rolling thunder, and the vault of stars. Poseidon took the sea, the depths, the storms, and all that swam or drowned within. And Hades, quietly and without protest, accepted the underworld, a place of shadows and silence where the souls of the dead would wander. He did not complain, nor did he smile. He simply nodded. Some roles choose their bearer. The earth, curiously, was left to all, or perhaps to none. The gods would walk it. So would mortals. But it belonged to neither. With dominion divided, the gods made their home atop Mount Olympus, a place high above mortal reach, where storms danced and the air was thick with ambrosia. From there they would rule. But peace did not settle immediately. Scars remained, resentment lingered. And even in their triumph, the gods were still young. Divine, yes, but prone to jealousy, pride, and an occasional poor decision involving mortal lovers. Still, a new age had begun. The age of Titans was over. The age of Olympians had risen. And while the thrones were now filled, the story was only just beginning. With the Titans defeated and the cosmos divided, the dust of war began to settle across the battered face of the world. Olympus stood untouched by the violence, or perhaps simply indifferent to it, rising high above the clouds, a peak of impossible beauty where mortal storms dared not tread. And it was here, amid marble halls and eternal sunrises, that the new gods began to build their rule. The Olympians were not many in number, but they were loud, bright, and impossible to ignore. They didn't ask for attention, they radiated it. And now, with the realms of sky, sea, and shadow neatly divided among the three brothers, it was time for something far more complicated: governance. Zeus, now king of the gods, took up his throne atop Olympus with all the grace of someone who had just invented the concept of rulership 5 minutes ago, and was fairly certain he was excellent at it. He was a god of thunder, yes, but also of law, order, hospitality, and, curiously, justice. Although the latter would soon prove to be more of an optional suggestion. With his thunderbolt in hand, and his beard growing increasingly dramatic, Zeus declared the new age begun. From now on, Olympus would be the centre of divine power, and he would sit at its centre. Zeus ruled the skies, the clouds, the wind, the rain, and the storms. Every roll of thunder was his voice, every flash of lightning his will. He was the judge, the enforcer, and occasionally the problem. He was known to be noble, but impulsive, wise, but easily distracted, and his distractions almost always involved mortal women, swans, golden showers, or some deeply questionable combination thereof. Poseidon, in contrast, was less dramatic, but far more volatile. As Lord of the Sea, he claimed dominion over every drop of water, from the deepest trench to the highest wave. He built a palace of coral and pearl beneath the ocean, surrounded by dolphins and sea beasts, and declared it his own private court. Poseidon was a god of earthquakes as well, which was unfortunate for coastal cities, as he was famously touchy. A bad mood from Poseidon could level entire towns. Still, he was not unkind. He had a soft spot for horses, which he allegedly created, and for sailors, whom he alternated between saving and drowning, depending on whether they remembered to offer him wine. Hades, eldest of the three, ruled the underworld, a realm of endless mist and shadow, where the dead arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet inevitability. His kingdom was not a place of fire and brimstone. It was solemn, vast, and cold. Rivers crossed it, the Styx, the Lethe, the Acheron, each with its own dreadful poetry. The souls of mortals wandered there, guided by Hermes and judged in silence. Hades did not reside on Olympus, preferring the company of shades to that of his siblings. He was not evil nor cruel, merely absolute. Where Zeus thundered and Poseidon surged, Hades endured. His kingdom did not end, and so neither did his watch. And then there were the others. Hera, queen of the gods, took her place beside Zeus, reluctantly, and with several raised eyebrows. She was the goddess of marriage and family, which some considered ironic given her husband's frequent adventures in shape-shifting seduction. Hera was proud, sharp, and deeply committed to her role. She did not forget insults, and she rarely forgave betrayals. Her domain included the sanctity of marriage, childbirth, and the defence of women. But she is best remembered for her jealous vengeance, often taken not on Zeus, but on the poor mortals he failed to resist. One might argue that she confused marital fidelity with pest control. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, tended to the earth. It was she who made crops grow and seasons turn. When she walked the fields, grain sprouted behind her feet. She was calm, maternal, and warm, but not to be crossed. The world would learn this lesson the hard way in time. Hestia, the gentlest of the Olympians, ruled over hearth and home. She received the first portion of every sacrifice and kept the fire burning in every city. She avoided the intrigues of her more theatrical siblings and remained steady, the one constant in a family of shifting tempers and sudden storms. And then came Athena, born fully grown and armoured from Zeus's skull, a detail best left unexamined. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, war, and crafts. She preferred strategy to savagery and thought before she acted, which made her a rare creature indeed on Olympus. She carried the aegis, a shield bearing the head of Medusa, and advised kings, heroes, and anyone who could tolerate being corrected mid-sentence. She was one of 3 virgin goddesses, sworn to no man, mortal or divine. Not that many would have dared try. Apollo and Artemis followed. Twins, radiant and deadly in their own right. Apollo was the god of the sun, music, prophecy, and medicine. He played the lyre with divine perfection, and occasionally used it to taunt people into becoming animals. His oracle at Delphi would soon become the most famous voice of prophecy in the world, even if her delivery left much to be desired in the clarity department. Artemis, his twin, ruled the moon, the hunt, and the wild places of the world. She walked beneath the trees with her bow and her hounds, guarding animals and young girls alike. Like Athena, she rejected the company of men, and, like Athena, reacted poorly when disturbed at bath time. Ares, the god of war, arrived with less fanfare but far more shouting. He represented the raw chaos of battle, blood, rage, and clanging armour. Where Athena was war's strategist, Ares was its tantrum. He was strong, loud, and frequently wounded in embarrassing ways. Even Zeus found him irritating, so did everyone else. Then came Hephaestus, god of fire and the forge. Born lame and cast from Olympus by his own mother, Hephaestus learned to create beauty from pain. His hands forged the weapons of gods and heroes. He built automatons of gold and crafted palaces of impossible engineering. Despite his brilliance, he was married off to Aphrodite, which led to precisely the sort of drama one expects when a quiet engineer marries the goddess of desire. Aphrodite, born from sea foam and divine scandal, ruled over love, beauty, and mischief. She could bend hearts like reeds and used that power liberally. She was captivating, vain, and occasionally vindictive. Her affairs were legend, as were the reactions of those she scorned. Cupid, or Eros, was her frequent companion, firing arrows of affection at mortals who usually didn't appreciate the timing. Then there was Hermes, the messenger god, the trickster, the traveller. Hermes wore winged sandals and carried a caduceus. He was the god of boundaries, thieves, merchants, and speech. He could move between worlds with ease and talk his way out of nearly anything. He was clever, fast, and entirely too pleased with himself. And lastly, Dionysus, god of wine, revelry, madness, and theatre. He arrived late to Olympus, but with great enthusiasm. His festivals would soon sweep across Greece like wildfire, equal parts joy and delirium. Dionysus was both freeing and dangerous, the thin line between celebration and frenzy. Together these 12, and a few rotating extras, became the Olympians. They were gods, yes, but also a family. A dysfunctional, vengeful, hilarious, and deeply theatrical family. They shaped the weather, fate, love, and war. They raised empires and doomed heroes. And they quarrelled, constantly. One might say the only thing more powerful than their divine abilities was their collective inability to mind their own business. But they were not distant. Unlike other gods who sat silently in unreachable heavens, the Olympians walked the earth. They took sides in battles, guided ships, whispered to poets, and occasionally turned people into shrubs. They were worshipped in temples, honoured with sacrifices, and cursed in private. Every city had its patron, every home its altar. And though they ruled from a mountain wrapped in cloud, they were, in spirit, very close. Olympus had risen. The gods had found their seats. And across the earth, the stories had only just begun. After the dust of the Titanomachy had settled, and the last thunderbolt echoed off the mountain tops, Zeus and his siblings assumed their roles as rulers of the cosmos. The universe had been divided. Zeus took the heavens, Poseidon claimed the seas, and Hades was given dominion over the underworld. With the Titans banished to Tartarus and the Olympians seated on their thrones, a new age began. The sky crackled with divine energy. The sea stirred under Poseidon's command. And deep below, the spirits of the dead began their long march through the misty halls of Hades. The earth, however, was eerily quiet. There were mountains, yes, vast and majestic. Rivers and forests teeming with life. Seasons turned in elegant cycles. Birds sang, and wild beasts prowled the land. But something essential was missing. There was no intelligence gazing up at the stars, no stories told by firelight, no fear or reverence directed toward the heavens. The gods had their kingdom, but no audience. Prometheus, the Titan whose name meant forethought, saw this void and felt it more acutely than any other. Where others had been content with power or vengeance, Prometheus had always been drawn to creation. He had fought alongside the Olympians during the war, not out of loyalty, but out of belief in the future they might build. A future, he realized, that was woefully incomplete without mortals to walk the earth. And so he descended from Olympus and wandered through the valleys and across the plains until he reached a quiet riverbank. There, kneeling in the mud, he gathered a handful of clay and began to shape it. Not out of arrogance or ambition, but with the careful precision of an artist and the quiet awe of a parent. He moulded limbs, curved a spine, added fingers to grasp, feet to roam, and eyes that could marvel at the sky. He formed mouths, not just to eat, but to question, to sing, to tell stories that would outlive them. When the forms were ready, he breathed life into them. A divine breath, not just air, but spark and soul, thought and fire. These were not animals, they were not gods, they were something entirely new. They were humans. At first, they were clumsy. They stumbled through the forests, confused and curious. They lacked claws, fur, or fangs. They feared the dark, the cold, the howl of wolves. But they learned quickly. They made tools of stone, mimicked the calls of birds, and formed crude shelters from branches and leaves. They were fragile, yes, but endlessly inventive. and to Prometheus they were magnificent. Zeus, however, was less impressed. From his golden throne on Olympus, he looked down at these new creatures and scowled. "They look like us," he said, voice thick with suspicion. "They were inspired by us," Prometheus replied evenly. "They're weak. Look at them. They don't even know how to survive a frost. They can learn. They shouldn't be learning. They should be worshipping," Zeus muttered. Prometheus said nothing. Zeus frowned. "Don't give them too much. Let them remain grateful." Prometheus nodded outwardly, but in his heart he disagreed. He continued to watch his creation. And what he saw troubled him. The humans cowered in caves when night fell, trembling in the cold. They ate their food raw, risking sickness. Their lives were short, their progress slow. What they needed, Prometheus knew, was fire. But fire was forbidden. It was divine, reserved for Olympus alone. It burned in Hestia's hearth, in Hephaestus' forge. No mortal was allowed to touch it. Zeus had declared it so, and his word was law. Prometheus stole it anyway. One night, while Olympus was shrouded in sleep and starlight, Prometheus crept to the hearth of Hestia. He plucked a single coal from the eternal flame and tucked it into a fennel stalk. An ordinary plant with a hollow stem, perfect for concealment. He slipped away, descending from the heavens with his precious, smouldering gift. When he gave it to humanity, the world changed. With fire, they transformed the night. They warmed themselves, cooked food, and forged stronger tools. They began to gather around flames and tell stories, to pass on knowledge, to dream. Smoke rose from their hearths like prayers. Fire became a symbol of everything that made them different from beasts, everything that hinted at the divine within them. Zeus was furious. "You gave them fire!" he roared, lightning crackling at his fingertips. "They needed it," Prometheus said. "They will challenge us. They will forget to fear. They will flourish." Zeus saw no wisdom in those words, only defiance. As punishment, he ordered Prometheus to be seized and chained to the highest, most desolate peak of the Caucasus Mountains. There, the Titan was bound with unbreakable chains, forged by Hephaestus himself, and left to the elements. But even that was not enough. Each day, an eagle, a monstrous divine bird, would descend and tear into Prometheus's side, devouring his liver. Each night, the wound healed, and each morning, the eagle returned. The cycle was endless, the pain eternal, and yet Prometheus endured. He did not beg. He did not repent. For in the far distance, he could still see the smoke of fires rising from human villages. His suffering, he believed, was a fair price. But Zeus was not finished. Prometheus had given humanity a gift. Now Zeus would give them one too. A gift wrapped in beauty, charm, and danger. He called upon Hephaestus once more, and the gods fashioned a woman from clay. She was shaped with care and gifted by each Olympian. From Aphrodite she received beauty, from Hermes persuasion, from Athena skill, from Hera pride, but from Zeus she received something else entirely, curiosity. They named her Pandora, meaning all gifted. To her, Zeus gave a sealed jar. "Do not open it," he warned. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you feel, leave it closed." And then he sent her down to earth. Prometheus, from his distant prison, had no way to warn his brother Epimetheus, who welcomed Pandora without hesitation. She was clever, kind, and filled with questions. She admired the humans, asked about their ways, their stories, their tools, but the jar haunted her. It sat quietly in their home, sealed tight, and yet it pulsed with mystery. What lay inside? Why was it forbidden? What would happen if... And one day, her curiosity won. She opened it. From within the jar exploded a torrent of miseries. Disease, envy, sorrow, madness, greed, war. All the suffering the world had never known before now poured into it. Pandora cried out and tried to close it, but the damage was done. She fell to her knees, trembling. But from the depths of the jar, she heard something else, something soft and steady. Hope, the last thing in the jar, the only thing that had not escaped. She closed the lid gently, keeping hope inside. And though the world was now filled with pain, with loss, and with fear, it also had hope. Humanity, for all its grief, did not fall. They fought, they mourned, they loved, and they tried again. Chained to the wind-blasted crags, Prometheus would sometimes close his eyes and remember the day he gave them fire. Not the theft, not the flight from Olympus, but the moment he watched their faces light up. He remembered how one child reached out to touch the flame and quickly pulled back, laughing, eyes wide with awe. He remembered the old woman who used it to cook food for the first time, the astonishment on her face when she realized the tubers didn't taste like soil anymore. That was the moment he knew he had done the right thing. The humans, meanwhile, evolved quickly. Fire allowed them to settle, to cook, to forge tools from bronze and iron. They began to sing, not just out of fear or grief, but joy. They created rituals around fire, danced beside it, married before it, whispered secrets into its embers. Their societies grew, crude but determined, with fire at the heart of every village. And Pandora, she was not wicked. She had not opened the jar out of malice. She had wept, not just for the pain she had released, but for the betrayal she felt, from the gods who had made her a weapon, from the silence of the heavens when she cried out. But hope had spoken to her too, not in words but in warmth, in stillness. It reminded her that even if she had been used, she was not beyond forgiveness. Zeus, in time, came to realize the humans would not be wiped away. They were tenacious. They prayed, they cursed, but they kept building, and their fires never went out. By the time Zeus had secured his place on the throne of Olympus, one might have hoped he'd settle into the routine of celestial leadership, passing judgment, throwing the occasional thunderbolt, maybe hosting a divine banquet or two. Instead, Olympus quickly became less a seat of power and more a swirling court of rumours, jealousies, and very loud arguments. At the centre of it all stood Zeus, king of the gods and serial destroyer of trust. For all his power and wisdom, Zeus had one consistent weakness: mortal women, and nymphs, and goddesses, and occasionally things that only looked vaguely like women. His tastes were eclectic, his disguises inventive, and his timing, by all divine accounts, terrible. But the one being who could never quite overlook these indiscretions was his wife, Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, and patron of eternal grudges. Their marriage was, in the politest terms, an ongoing diplomatic crisis. To understand Hera's fury, one must understand the scale of Zeus's extracurricular activity. He did not simply flirt. He transformed himself into golden rain, bulls, swans, and clouds, all to pursue love or lust, depending on your interpretation. Each affair left behind not only a trail of divine gossip, but a legacy of demigods, heroes, and mortal tragedy. Take Io, for instance, a priestess of Hera herself. Zeus approached her in secret, whispering sweet nothings with the confidence of a god who thought himself untouchable. But Hera's suspicions were never far behind, As Zeus saw his wife approaching, he panicked and turned Io into a beautiful white cow. A fine solution had Hera not immediately demanded the animal as a gift. Cornered, Zeus obliged. Io, now thoroughly bovine, was handed over to Hera, who promptly assigned Argus Panoptes, the 100-eyed guardian, to keep watch. To free Io, Zeus enlisted Hermes, who lulled Argus to sleep with music before killing him and releasing the poor girl. Hera, naturally, retaliated by sending a gadfly to torment Io endlessly, stinging her into a frantic journey across the known world. Io's footsteps carved place names into maps, the Ionian Sea, the Bosporus, and though she would eventually reach Egypt and be restored to her human form, her tale was never quite forgotten, nor was Hera's wrath. Another of Zeus's better-known pursuits was Leto, a gentle titaness who bore a quiet dignity and very little interest in becoming the centre of a divine scandal. But when she became pregnant with Zeus's children, twins no less, Hera flew into a fury. She decreed that no land under the sun should give Leto sanctuary. The desperate mother-to-be wandered from island to island, turned away by cities and shores alike. Finally, she arrived at the floating island of Delos, a place not tethered to the earth, and thus exempt from Hera's curse. There, after 9 agonizing days of labour, Leto gave birth to Artemis and then Apollo, 2 of the most influential gods of Olympus. Hera had tried to delay their entry into the world. What she got instead were 2 children who would shape mythology forever. Apollo, the god of light, music and prophecy. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and guardian of the wild. Both remembered what their mother endured. And then there was Semele, a mortal woman from Thebes, who, unlike Io or Leto, did not flee Zeus's advances. She loved him, and for once Zeus loved her back. But this story, too, did not end well. Hera, in one of her more cunning moods, disguised herself as an old nurse and visited Semele, planting seeds of doubt in her mind. "If your lover is truly Zeus," she said sweetly, "should he not reveal himself to you in all his glory?" Semele, young and trusting, asked Zeus to do just that. Bound by an oath he could not break, Zeus revealed his divine form, and Semele was instantly incinerated by the sheer force of his presence. It was, to put it mildly, not the romantic climax she had imagined. Yet from the ashes came Dionysus. Zeus rescued the unborn child by sewing him into his own thigh until he was ready to be born, a detail rarely featured in lullabies. Dionysus, god of wine, madness and theatre, would grow into one of the most unpredictable deities in the Greek pantheon. His birth, both tragic and miraculous, was another strange testament to Zeus's chaotic domestic life. These weren't isolated incidents. Zeus's unions, consensual or otherwise, with mortals, nymphs and goddesses alike, produced a sprawling genealogy of heroes and demigods. Heracles, born of Alcmene. Perseus, son of Danae. Helen of Troy, supposedly hatched from an egg after Zeus seduced, or assaulted, her mother Leda in the form of a swan. The stories vary in tone, but are united by their consequences. Human history, in myth, was shaped by divine passion, and Hera's furious fallout. Hera's vengeance was rarely directed at Zeus himself. He was king, and even she, powerful as she was, could not overrule his will. Instead, her fury fell upon the women he seduced and the children they bore. Sometimes this meant banishment, sometimes torment, sometimes the slow corrosion of fate. In Heracles' case, it meant a lifetime of madness and suffering, designed to humble even the strongest son of Zeus. But Hera was more than just a jealous wife. She was queen of Olympus, the protector of marriage, and a goddess who demanded respect. Her punishments, though harsh, were consistent. She embodied order in a pantheon of chaos, permanence in a world shaped by whim. And yet, for all their conflict, Zeus and Hera stayed together. Perhaps out of divine obligation. Perhaps out of stubbornness. Or perhaps because the heavens themselves needed a king and queen to mirror the mortal structures below. Their marriage, filled with betrayal and bickering, reflected not perfection but permanence, a truth familiar to many who stayed in relationships well past the dramatic bits. In a strange way, these affairs, these tangled, scandalous unions, served a cosmic purpose. The world of men was populated not by the children of dirt alone, but by those who bore divine blood. These offspring became the bridge between gods and mortals. They fought wars, founded cities, slew monsters, and often lived just long enough to inspire a tragic song. And the gods watched them, proud and exasperated in equal measure. Zeus, for all his wandering desires, never stopped asserting control from Olympus. Hera, for all her grievances, never relinquished her crown. Their disputes became divine theatre, shaping weather, politics, and fate. One thunderbolt from Zeus might signal a divine tantrum. One withering glance from Hera could doom a kingdom. And mortals, those unlucky enough to fall into their drama, rarely escaped unscathed. So the gossip of Olympus continued. Mortals whispered about gods falling in love and being punished for it. Nymphs avoided cloud-shaped strangers. Kings built temples in Hera's name, hoping to avoid her ire. And the world spun on, tangled in the affections and fury of its heavenly rulers. For all the chaos Zeus caused, and for all the revenge Hera unleashed, there was one constant. Their stories lived on. Told in temples and whispered around hearth-fires, they became the myths that explained not just thunder and childbirth, but betrayal, jealousy, and the strange persistence of love. And somewhere, high on Olympus, or hidden in the clouds, Zeus likely smiled at another mortal girl, and Hera sharpened her stare. And for mortals, these stories weren't simply entertainment. They were cautionary tales, moral blueprints, and strangely comforting explanations for the unexplainable. Why did love so often lead to tragedy? Why were some people born into greatness, while others were fated to suffer? The myths offered answers, albeit ones dressed in divine drama and poetic injustice. Children who grew up hearing these tales knew better than to tempt fate or gods. Young lovers invoked Aphrodite's name with trembling lips. Expectant mothers whispered prayers to Hera, begging her not to take offence at their happiness. Farmers left offerings at roadside shrines, not just for harvest, but in hopes that their daughters might be spared the attention of wandering gods. And yet, despite the pain in these tales, there was something beautiful in them too. Even the gods, for all their power, were tangled in longing and fury, guilt and pride. They hurt each other. They stayed in messy marriages. They mourned what they destroyed. It made the cosmos feel less like a cold, perfect machine, and more like a mirror. One where human hearts could recognize their own flaws in celestial form. For all their immortal glory, the gods were never far from mortal emotion. And that, perhaps, is why we still tell their stories. By the time the gods had firmly established their places atop Olympus and etched their names into temples and myths across the Greek world, one question still lingered among mortals and immortals alike. Who, among all these divine beings, would guide civilization forward? not just with strength or power, but with wisdom, skill, and something more lasting than conquest? The answer, as it turned out, would emerge not through war, but through a contest. At the heart of this tale was a fledgling city, a coastal settlement nestled between rocky hills and the sapphire waters of the Aegean. The people who lived there were resourceful but uncertain. They had stone, they had salt, they had sun, and they had gods. What they needed was a patron, one who would watch over them, protect them, and give their city a name worthy of the ages. Two gods stepped forward. The first was Poseidon, lord of the sea, earth shaker, tamer of horses, and occasional flood enthusiast. He was powerful, proud, and loud. The second was Athena, goddess of wisdom, warfare, weaving, and well-timed restraint. She was calm, calculating, and never one to show off unless it proved a point. They both laid claim to the city, and rather than plunge the heavens into yet another divine quarrel, the gods agreed on a challenge. Whichever deity could offer the more useful gift to the people would earn the city's devotion. Poseidon, never one to wait his turn, strode into the heart of the city square and raised his mighty trident. With a dramatic flourish, he struck the rocky earth. The ground trembled, lightning split the sky for flare, and from the stone burst forth a magnificent spring of water. The crowd gasped. The spring sparkled in the sunlight, cool and clear. Then someone took a sip. It was salt water. Poseidon, god of oceans, had given the city a salt spring. To his credit, it was a beautiful salt spring, glimmering, mysterious, perhaps even good for exfoliating. But as the people tasted it and began coughing politely into their togas, it became clear that salty drinking water was less of a blessing and more of a cautionary tale. Athena waited for the murmurs to fade. Then, with quiet grace, she stepped forward. Kneeling beside the parched soil, she pressed her fingers to the earth. From that spot, a small shoot emerged. It grew, slowly, gently, until it became a sturdy olive tree, its leaves catching the breeze, and its branches heavy with promise. The people gathered close. They tasted the olives, pressed them into oil, rubbed it on wounds, burned it in lamps. They marvelled at the tree's shade, its fruit, its longevity. No theatrics, no thunder, just a tree, a future. The gods judged Athena the victor, and the city was named Athens in her honour. It was a turning point, not just for one city, but for the whole mythological landscape. While Poseidon returned to his waves, Athena became a symbol of something new. Intellect over impulse, patience over bluster, growth over spectacle. But Athena was never just the goddess of cleverness. She embodied practical wisdom, knowledge applied. She was the patron of architects and strategists, of artisans and thinkers. She didn't just win wars, she prevented them, or at least ensured they were fought wisely. She also had a talent for invention. The bridle, the ship, the chariot, all innovations guided by her unseen hand. Music, mathematics, philosophy, her gifts shaped them all. While Ares roared across battlefields, Athena quietly built the city that could outlast the war. Still, for all her restraint, Athena was not immune to pride. This brings us to the story of Arachne. In a small town far from Olympus, a young woman sat at a loom. Her name was Arachne, and her weaving was extraordinary. Her tapestries shimmered with life. Scenes of forests and feasts, gods and monsters, threaded with colour so fine it seemed divine. People travelled for miles to see her work, and Arachne welcomed them with quiet confidence. Until one day she began to boast. "They say Athena taught me," she said to a wide-eyed crowd. "But I taught myself, and I weave better than any god. Now, if history has taught us anything, it's that comparing oneself to a god is rarely the start of a restful afternoon." Athena heard the claim, and while she could have reduced the girl's house to rubble or turned her loom into ash, she chose instead to appear in disguise, an old woman stooped with time. "You should be careful," she warned gently. "The gods do not take kindly to such pride." Arachne shrugged. Let her come. I'd challenge Athena herself if she dared." Athena dropped the disguise. The loom fell silent. "I accept," the goddess said. The two began to weave. Athena's tapestry showed the gods in all their glory, regal and wise, mighty and fair. It was a masterwork of divine dignity, every thread singing with celestial pride. Arachne, for her part, wove something different. Her tapestry told the truth. It showed the gods' mistakes, their petty rivalries, their jealousies and cruelties. It depicted Zeus's many disguises, Hera's rages, Apollo's curses. The images were vivid, honest, and flawless. When they finished, Athena examined both works. She could find no fault in Arachne's weaving. No missed stitch, no clumsy pattern. It was perfect, and it was insulting. Not because it was false, but because it was true. Athena's anger flared, not with jealousy, but with disappointment. The girl had talent, yes, but no reverence, no humility. So Athena did what gods often do when their pride is pricked. She punished her. With a single touch, she transformed Arachne into the first spider, 8-legged, quick-fingered, forever weaving in silence. Her descendants would continue the craft, spinning intricate webs across trees and doorways, threading beauty through air itself. It was a lesson, not just about pride, but about the fine line between talent and arrogance. Athena did not hate excellence. She demanded it. But she demanded respect too, for gods, for gifts, for the delicate balance between inspiration and hubris. And in that, she was no different from the city she protected. Athens, under her watch, became the cradle of learning and art, of philosophy and democracy. Its streets were lined with sculpture and debate, with marble colonnades and whispered poetry. The olive tree still stood in the Acropolis, a quiet reminder of the day wisdom bested force. Yet Athena was never a goddess of comfort. She inspired, yes, but she also challenged. She pushed mortals to think harder, build better, question deeper. Her favour came not to the strongest, but to the clever, the disciplined, the bold. She watched the world not with warmth, but with clarity, and from her place above the city that bore her name, she waited for those who dared to think. Athena's influence didn't stop at invention or battle strategy. Her very presence on Olympus helped shift the nature of divinity itself. She represented a new kind of power, one that didn't thunder or storm, but reasoned, observed, and guided. And the mortals who honoured her began to reflect that shift. They carved her statues not just with swords and shields, but with books, scrolls, and thoughtful expressions. Her temples were filled not only with offerings, but with ideas. Debates broke out in her name. Laws were argued beneath her gaze. Artists painted under her inspiration. Mathematicians named theorems in her honour. And poets, who usually preferred Apollo, whispered her name when they finally found the right phrase. Cities under her protection didn't just grow, they flourished. But Athena was no stranger to war. Though not bloodthirsty like Ares, she led battles when they were just. She stood behind Odysseus with every cunning twist he made. she guided Perseus on his deadly quest against Medusa. Her gift was not brute strength, but strategic clarity. She didn't charge first, she calculated first, and then she won. And always she returned to Athens. The olive tree she gifted stood as both a memory and a promise, of peace through preparation, of beauty born from simplicity, of the quiet strength of something that grows, endures, and feeds. In the hush of night, as lamps flickered across marble porticos and the sea wind rustled olive branches, the people of Athens would look up to the Acropolis. There, in the moonlight, stood her temple, and though she was silent, they knew she was watching, not with judgment, but with expectation, because to be under Athena's protection was not just to be safe, it was to be challenged to become something more. The birth of the twins, Apollo and Artemis, was not just the arrival of two new gods. It was a celestial event that shook both Olympus and the mortal world. Born to the Titaness Leto after a grueling 9-day labour and a lengthy game of divine keep-away orchestrated by Hera, these siblings were destined to embody both light and shadow, grace and vengeance. One would command the sun and song, the other the moon and the hunt. And though their domains were beautiful, their wrath would prove legendary. Apollo emerged first, radiant, golden, charismatic. Even as a newborn, his eyes were said to gleam like sunrise over calm seas. He was a god of many talents: music, healing, prophecy, poetry, and, less humbly, being correct at all times. Artemis followed, calm and composed, her silence sharper than any arrow. She was the guardian of wild things, the goddess of untamed forests, of childbirth, and of the perfect shot taken without hesitation. Their childhood was brief. As was customary for Greek gods, the twins were given a few hours to admire infancy before reaching full maturity and heading off to chase monsters, smite arrogance, and cause occasional emotional turmoil. Apollo's first great act came quickly. He remembered his mother's suffering, how the monstrous serpent Python, sent by Hera, had hounded Leto across the lands. Now that he had limbs and divine authority, Apollo sought revenge. He travelled to the base of Mount Parnassus, where Python slithered in his foul temple, oozing poison and ancient spite. Armed with a silver bow gifted by Hephaestus, Apollo loosed arrow after arrow into the beast, each one whistling through the air like a divine accusation. The creature howled and writhed, but the god did not relent. By the time Python collapsed, the valley was silent. No bird dared chirp. Where the serpent's body fell, Apollo erected a new temple, a place of prophecy and insight to cleanse the stench of fear. This became the Oracle of Delphi, the most sacred site in the ancient world. There, a priestess known as the Pythia would inhale vapours from a crack in the earth, enter a trance, and speak Apollo's truths in riddles. Mortals came from every corner of Greece, desperate for answers, and many left even more confused, but in awe nonetheless. Apollo was radiant, yes, but he was not gentle. Apollo's light could warm the soul or burn it, and his affections, once ignited, were notoriously difficult to extinguish. One day, while striding through the forest with his bow slung over one shoulder and a smug grin under a crown of laurels, Apollo encountered Eros, the god of love, more commonly known as Cupid to the Romans. Eros was small, winged, and usually overlooked, which made him dangerously easy to underestimate. Apollo, flushed with his recent victory over Python and no longer interested in humility, made a remark. "Careful where you point that little toy ball. he said with a laugh. "Leave real archery to the gods." Eros did not laugh. Instead he reached for 2 arrows, one tipped in gold, kindling love, the other in lead, snuffing it out. With calm precision he fired the golden arrow into Apollo's chest and the lead one into the heart of a nymph named Daphne, who had been minding her own business nearby, unaware she was about to be pursued by a love-struck god with the subtlety of a golden retriever. Apollo's passion ignited instantly. Daphne, struck with utter revulsion, fled. What followed was a desperate and poetic chase. Through meadows and over rivers, Apollo called out declarations of love and sonnets mid-sprint, while Daphne barely looked over her shoulder. She begged the river god, her father, for salvation, and he granted it, transforming her body into a laurel tree just as Apollo reached her. Apollo fell to his knees and wept, pressing his hands to the bark, still warm. To honour her, he declared the laurel his sacred tree. From that moment on, every poet, every victor, every crowned hero would wear a wreath of Daphne's leaves, a symbol of glory, and a quiet reminder that some things do not want to be caught. Artemis, for her part, was less easily tricked. Fiercely independent and eternally chaste, she roamed forests with her band of maiden huntresses, bow in hand, hair unbound, and a deep mistrust of anyone with a beard. Her wrath, though rare, was decisive. Take the story of Actaeon. One quiet afternoon, the young hunter stumbled upon Artemis as she bathed in a secluded glade. His eyes widened, his footsteps froze. He did not speak, did not move, but it was too late. He had seen her, and she had seen him. With a single glare, Artemis transformed Actaeon into a stag. Confused and frightened, he fled, only to be pursued and torn apart by his own hunting dogs, who failed to recognize their master. Artemis did not gloat, she did not grin. She simply returned to the water, untouched and unrepentant. She was not cruel, but she was divine. And that meant she expected respect without warning. Their duality, Apollo and Artemis, shaped Greek thought in subtle ways. He ruled the sun, she the moon. He gave prophecy, she protected birth. He punished through heat, she through silence. Together they were not opposites, but complements. Light and coolness, music and motion, fury and form. Apollo's followers built grand temples. Artemis's devotees left offerings in forest groves. And both, though loved, were feared. Because both demanded purity, one of intent, the other of self. And both were reminders that beauty, when paired with divinity, could be devastating. Apollo's complexity only deepened over time. He could heal with one hand and curse with the other. When his sacred honour was violated, or his pride bruised, he did not always choose forgiveness. He once flayed a satyr, alive for daring to challenge him to a music contest. Marsyas had played the flute with passion, but Apollo played the lyre with perfection. The Muses declared Apollo the winner. Marsyas, bound to a tree, declared it unfair. Apollo replied with silence, followed by skinning. Then there was Niobe, queen of Thebes, who boasted of her many children, some say 12, others 14, and mocked Leto for having only 2. She forgot, of course, that Leto's 2 were Artemis and Apollo, and that neither sibling took criticism lightly. Descending like a storm, Apollo slew her sons, Artemis her daughters. Only one child was spared, depending on which poet you ask. Niobe, once proud and radiant, fled to Mount Sipylus, where she turned to stone. To this day, the mountain is said to weep, tears running down her face with every rainstorm, a grief too deep for mortals, too justified for gods. And yet Apollo was not without mercy. He healed as much as he harmed. He protected the young, inspired musicians and whispered to prophets. He had mortal lovers, male and female, whose ends were rarely happy but whose memories lived in songs and statues. He was, in essence, a god of contradiction. Artemis, too, bore contradictions. She aided women in childbirth, but demanded their silence in her forests. She blessed the hunt, but protected animals from senseless cruelty. She loathed men's advances, yet often watched over them from the trees. A stern guardian, yes, but also a quiet comfort to those who walked alone at night. Mortals feared them not because they were cruel, but because they were too vast to understand. You might earn Apollo's favour with a melody, or his wrath with a wrong note. You might cross Artemis's path and be blessed with safe travels, or end up as a cautionary myth told around campfires. And yet, for all their power, there was a strange and tender bond between the twins. In a pantheon where siblings often plotted and poisoned, Apollo and Artemis remained close. When one grieved, the other grew silent. When one triumphed, the other smiled. They were two halves of a divine whole, sun and moon, prophecy and instinct, fury and grace. Together they reminded mortals of this. Beauty does not equal safety, and power, no matter how radiant, always comes with a shadow. The age of gods was never truly quiet, but for a time it seemed as though the world had found its rhythm. The Olympians ruled from above. The seasons turned. Mortals offered their sacrifices with trembling fingers and hopeful eyes. And yet, for all this balance, there was something brewing, a slow, sullen rot beneath the rituals and hymns. Humanity, it turned out, was beginning to misbehave. They had once been golden, literally. The first humans, crafted by the gods, lived in harmony. They spoke in song, shared their harvests, and never locked their doors. There were no wars, no greed, no taxes. But the Golden Age, like most good things in myth, did not last. What followed was the Silver Age, a time of decline. The new men were longer of limb, but shorter